Welcome back to the Kingdom Paneling podcast. In our last conversation, we talked about leadership load, the weight leaders carry that does not show up on a calendar, the relational carryover, the decision saturation, the quiet disappearance of reflection time. Today, I want to build on that because there is a pattern underneath much of that weight that tends to go unnamed. And when it goes unnamed, leaders keep absorbing the pressure without ever being able to locate where it's actually coming from. This episode is about the relationship between authority and responsibility. What happens when those two things come apart and how that misalignment forms what it feels like from the inside and why it so often gets misread as something else entirely. If you have ever felt fully accountable for outcomes you cannot fully influence, this conversation is for you. Here is one of the most common sources of leadership strain I encounter and one of the least talked about. Responsibility expands faster than authority is clarified. A leader is asked to produce outcomes, solve problems, guide a team, and hold results. But the decision ownership around all of that remains undefined. It accumulates gradually, relationally, without formal conversation. And over time, expectations grow in one direction, while the clarity needed to meet them does not grow at the same pace. In ministry environments, especially, this pattern is common. Roles evolve through relationship rather than structure. Someone steps in because there is a need, the need gets met, the expectations quietly settle, and now that leader is carrying responsibility that was never formally assigned and operating with an authority that was never clearly defined. The result of that kind of pressure is very difficult to explain. It's not about workload exactly, it's about the weight of being accountable for something you cannot fully control. That gap between responsibility and authority is what this episode is about. Authority drift does not announce itself. It develops quietly, usually through a sequence of reasonable decisions made during seasons of growth or change. A senior leader steps into a sensitive situation because the need is real and the timing matters. A team member defers to someone else because direction feels uncertain and acting alone feels risky. A pastor makes a decision that technically belongs at another level because waiting feels inefficient and the mission is moving. Each of these moments is understandable. None of them is a mistake exactly, but accumulated over time, they replace intentional structure with improvised habit. And improvised habit is very difficult to examine from inside the organization that has been built itself around it. What makes this particularly hard to see is that it does not feel structural while it is forming. It feels like a busy season, a stretch of relational tension, a run of decisions that seem harder than they should. The structural source remains invisible while the weight of it lands personally. And by the time leaders notice something is off, the pattern has usually been present for long enough that the organization has adapted around it. Teams have learned who actually decides. Approvals have become unofficial checkpoints. Escalation has become the default rather than the exception. Acts 6:3 says, "And so, brothers, select 7 men who are well respected and are full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will give them this responsibility." The early church faced this directly. Growing demand had concentrated at the center of the organization in ways that were not sustainable. What that passage describes is not a program or a corrective plan. It is a moment of honest recognition followed by a deliberate decision about how responsibility will be held. That kind of recognition is worth noticing. It does not begin with a solution. It begins with seeing clearly what the structure is actually asking of the people within it. Let me describe what authority drift tends to look like once it is present. Decisions begin requiring approvals that were not originally part of the process. What began as a senior leader staying informed gradually becomes an unofficial checkpoint.
Sure.
Team members learn to route certain decisions upward, even when their role technically authorizes them to ask. No single moment caused this. The organization simply adapted. Meeting agendas began carrying operational questions that used to resolve at a staff level. Leadership time increasingly focuses on clarifying direction rather than setting it. Senior leaders find themselves pulled into day-to-day management they did not anticipate, and stepping back feels risky because the team has come to depend on that involvement. The work of senior leadership quietly shifts from guiding the future towards managing the present, and often no one names that the shift has even occurred. Staff members express uncertainty about which decisions belong to them. Initiative slows, not because people lack competence, but because the boundaries around action feel undefined. The organization keeps moving, but with more friction than the reason and the mission requires. That friction is rarely attributed to its structural source. It tends to get absorbed as a relational issue, a communication problem, or simply the cost of complexity, when the actual source is actually much more specific. There is also something that happens to the pace of the organization. When authority is unclear, decisions take longer than they should, not because leaders are careless or indecisive, but because the path to a final answer is never quite direct. Questions move upward. They get clarified, reconsidered, and sent back down. What should be a clear and confident move becomes a process that requires multiple touch points before it can close. Over time, the organization learns to expect that pace. It builds it into how it plans, and when that expectation is deeply enough established, speed itself begins to feel like risk. Moving quickly starts to seem like bypassing the process, even when the process was never designed to be this slow. That is what authority drift does to an organization's confidence. It teaches caution in places where confidence should live. Several patterns tend to surface when authority and responsibility have come apart. Leaders feel accountable for outcomes they cannot directly influence. They carry the weight of results without the authority to shape the conditions that produce them. Teams repeatedly seek confirmation before acting. Even when the delegation has already happened, people return to senior leadership for reassurance that their decision is acceptable. The delegation exists formally, but the authority has not been genuinely transferred. Decisions revisit senior leadership after they have already been made. A choice gets made, surfaces for review, and gets redirected. Over time, people learn that finality depends on review from the top, regardless of what the structure technically says. And perhaps most telling, leaders carry relational tension from decisions they did not fully control. They are held responsible for outcomes that flowed from authority they did not actually have. That tension has nowhere constructive to go. Over time, it contributes to fatigue and hesitation that is easy to misread as a personal issue when the actual source is structural. Proverbs 11:14 says, "Plans go wrong for lack of advice. Many advisors bring success." Shared leadership does not weaken authority, it strengthens collective wisdom and organizational resilience. But shared leadership only functions sustainably when the boundaries around each leader's authority are clear. Without that clarity, even well-intentioned distribution of responsibility generates confusion rather than capacity. The gap between the intent and the outcome is almost always structural, and it is almost always present longer than anyone has named it. When authority and responsibility are misaligned, the most immediate impact is often internal rather than visible. Leaders carry a kind of ambient pressure that is difficult to name. They work hard, serve faithfully, remain committed to the mission, yet something feels consistently unresolved. Energy gets spent compensating for structural gaps rather than moving the organization forward. And because the source is structural rather than personal, the compensation never quite resolves it. Leaders who recognize this pattern in themselves are not failing in their calling. They are identifying something real that the organization has not yet named. That distinction matters because leaders who interpret structural strain as personal failure are less likely to surface it, which means the structural conditions that generated it stay in place. There is something worth naming here. This strain rarely stays contained to one leader. When a senior leader absorbs decisions that should be long to at other levels of the organization, it sends a signal to the broader team that authority is uncertain. That signal travels quietly. Over time, it shapes how people engage, how much initiative they take, and how much genuine ownership they feel for the work. The weight one leader carries can become the caution the whole team learns. Organizations reflect their leaders, but they also reflect their structures. When structure is unclear, even healthy leaders begin to lead differently than they otherwise would. There is something worth saying specifically about what happens to the leader who absorbs all of this well. Adaptation is a gift. Leaders who can flex, absorb, and keep the mission moving through structural ambiguity are genuinely valuable. The problem is not that they adapt. The problem is that adaptation can become invisible to the organization as a cost being paid by a person. When a leader absorbs decisions that should belong elsewhere, the team stops developing the capacity to hold those decisions. When a leader compensates for unclear authority boundaries by simply carrying more, the structural gap never gets examined because the visible outcome is still good. The mission continues, the work gets done, and the load quietly increases. Leaders in this position often describe a particular kind of fatigue that is difficult to explain to people who have not experienced it. It is not exhaustion from hard work exactly. It is something closer to the fatigue of sustained vigilance. The effort required to stay one step ahead of the confusion, to preempt the questions before they surface, to hold relational tension between the roles that were never clearly defined. That kind of fatigue does not show up in productivity. It shows up in the quality of presence. The leader is still performing, still delivering, but the margin that once allowed for creative thinking, for patient relationship, for the kind of unhurried attention that good leadership requires, that margin has been consumed. And here's what makes it particularly difficult to address. Leaders who carry this well are rarely the ones who raise their hand and say something needs to change. They are more likely to interpret this as the weight of their calling. They see endurance as faithfulness, to assume that if they just manage it well long enough, the pressure will eventually cease. Sometimes it does. More often, the conditions that produce it remain in place, and the weight simply increases with the next season of growth. Galatians 6:5 says, "For we are each responsible for our own conduct." Personal responsibility is a real and important value, but it sits alongside another truth in the same passage, that bearing one another's burdens reflects the law of Christ. What that tension points toward is not a formula for restructuring. It is an honest question about what each person in an organization is actually being asked to carry and whether the structure around them was ever designed to hold that weight. Before I move toward the close, I want to offer a few questions that are worth sitting with honestly. Does your leadership role feel heavier than the scope of your work would suggest it should? Are there decisions your team brings to you that you sense should belong somewhere else but have never been formally redirected? When you look at how responsibility is distributed across your organization, does clarity come easily or does it require careful thought? Is there a gap between what your leaders are accountable for and what they have genuine authority to do? And here's one more worth sitting with. If the most capable person in a given role left tomorrow, which decisions and responsibilities would have no clear owner? The answer to that question often reveals how much of the organization's structural load is quietly being held by individual capacity rather than defined structure. That is not failure. In many cases, it is the natural outcome of a healthy organization that grew faster than its structure was examined. Growth is good. Complexity is often the cost of fruitfulness. But complexity that is absorbed personally rather than named tends to compound quietly over time, and it tends to compound in ways that are very difficult to see from inside the organization carrying it. These questions are not a self-assessment. They are an invitation to notice what you already sense. You do not need to resolve them here. Naming what is present is meaningful on its own. What many leadership teams discover is that what felt like a personnel issue, a communication breakdown, or a difficult season was actually a structural condition that has been present for longer than they realized. James 3:13 says, "If you are wise and understand God's ways, prove it by living an honorable life, doing good works with the humility that comes from wisdom." The leaders who serve their organizations best over time are not necessarily those who carry the most. But what allows a leader to carry less is not always a personal decision that they make on their own. It is often a structural question the organization has not yet sat with honestly. This episode will not answer that question, but it may help name what the question actually is. If some of what we covered today felt familiar, I want to say something directly. Recognition matters. Not because recognition alone changes anything, but because many leaders carry what we described today without a framework that helps them locate what they are sensing. They know the work feels harder than it should. They know something in the structure is generating pressure that does not seem to resolve. But without language for what is actually happening, the experience tends to get turned inward. It becomes a personal question rather than a structural one. That is a costly misread. Not because the personal dimension is irrelevant, but because when leaders diagnose a structural problem as a personal one, they apply personal solutions. More discipline, more resilience, more endurance, and those things may help for a season, but they do not reach the source of what is generating the strain. The structure remains, although the load remains, and the next season of growth adds to both without anyone having named what was actually happening in the first place. What I hope this conversation offered is a different frame. Authority drift is common in growing ministry organizations. It forms through good intentions. It is not a failure of leadership character. And it is the kind of thing that benefits considerably from an outside perspective because the people inside the system have already adapted to it. They can no longer see it clearly from where they stand, not because they lack discernment, but because they are too close to it and too accustomed to carrying its weight. Seeing clearly often requires a different vantage point. That is not a weakness, it is a wisdom. And that is the kind of conversation we at Kingdom Planning exist to support, not from outside the reality of ministry leadership, but alongside of it. If this conversation was useful, here are a few ways to go further. First, the Lead and Deliver newsletter goes deeper on topics like this one on every issue, including practical observations in a book corner that connects organizational thinking to ministry and nonprofit leadership. You can subscribe at kingdomplanning.org/newsletter. Second, the Kingdom Planning Leadership Clarity Field Guide covers these patterns in structured details across 5 modules. Module 1 addresses early organizational signals. Module 2 focuses on leadership load and capacity drift. And this conversation was drawn from Module 3, which examines the relationship between authority and responsibility. You can access all of them at kingdomplanning.org and clicking on the Resources tab completely free of charge. Third, if something in today's episode prompted a more specific question about your own context, I would welcome a conversation. I offer a free 20-minute leadership clarity consultation for church and nonprofit leaders and business owners. No pressure, just a focused conversation about what you are actually navigating. You can schedule that at kingdomplanning.org/contact. Thank you for listening to the Kingdom Planning Podcast. Remember, take time to step back so you can see clearly. Ask Father to help you lead courageously so that you can steward faithfully. under His authority. Stay blessed. We'll see you next time.